Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. This week we'll be continuing our conversation. This will be our second week of our conversation about epistemology and the philosophy of mind. Our focus this week will be on what's known as the mind-body problem. But we're continuing our discussion of Descartes and his meditations. And just by way of a brief review, I want to remind you that as of the end of the second meditation, Descartes takes himself to have established a couple of things. First of all, that he exists by means of the cogito ergo sum argument. Secondly, he takes himself to know how things seem to him to be, so that even if he can't be sure, for example, that he's got a pair of hands, he can be sure that it seems to him as if he does. Likewise, for other so-called cases of second-order knowledge, he can know about the contents of his mind, even if he can't be sure that those mental events happening inside of him that refer to things outside of him do so accurately. Insofar as he has mental contents that are directed towards other contents of his mind, he can be confident that the former are accurate representations of the latter. He also takes himself to know what kind of being he is, what sort of thing he is. And his answer to that question, what kind of thing he is that he's a thing that thinks and wills and imagines and doubts. That is, a being that is capable of performing what you might call mental acts. He thinks that is somehow very closely bound up with his nature. He also takes himself to have established what kinds of properties external objects would have if there are any. He doesn't take himself to have established that there are any external objects, but he thinks that he knows that if there are any objects external to his own mind, he knows what they would have to be like. In particular, they would have to be the possessors of only primary qualities, no secondary qualities. So remembering what we discussed about the piece of wax passage, that piece of wax passage is one that Descartes takes to have established that objects in the external world, if there are any, can only be accurately characterized in terms of the primary qualities of extension, number, location, what we might now call mass, location in space-time, and so on, as opposed to these secondary qualities which are not part of their nature. For example, things such as taste, color, smell, feel to the touch, and so on. Those are secondary qualities that are, in a sense, in us rather than in the objects themselves, according to Descartes. Now, as we move into meditation 3, Descartes provides what you might think of as an unusual cosmological argument. He suggests that he finds inside of himself, in particular something inside of his mind, that he thinks can only be explained by supposing that something like a GCB put it there. He writes on page 31 of the Meditations, "For although the idea of substance is in me by virtue of the fact that I am a substance, that fact is not sufficient to explain my having the idea of an infinite substance, since I'm finite, unless this idea proceeded from some substance which really was infinite." His idea there is as follows. He has the idea of an infinite substance, a thing that is limitless in every way, perhaps. And his thought is, well, I've got this thing inside of me, an idea of an infinite substance, and I don't think I could have created it. I don't think I could have been the source of that idea. It's, in a sense, too great, too perfect, too beyond my consideration and my understanding for me to have produced. And therefore, it must have proceeded from something that had an equal amount of infinity in it, of intensity, so to speak, inside of it. And that, he thinks, could only have been the GCB, that is, a being that is the greatest conceivable. So he gives, in a kind of, on the basis of introspecting and finding himself with the idea of an infinitely perfect being, an infinite substance, the idea, he concludes, is that that could only have come about if it were created by a GCB itself, in a way not too dissimilar from Clarke's later argument suggesting that if we want an explanation for the entire infinite series of causal beings, of dependent beings, we've got to posit at least one independent being as well. So too for Descartes, his own kind of introspective cosmological argument is one that he tries to use to show that by just introspecting and finding this idea of a very peculiar kind inside of me, the only explanation I could give of where that could have come from is that it proceeded from something very peculiar also, namely a GCB.